On the right bank of the Dnieper in the Kherson region, an event took place that became one of the most notable news items of the last 24 hours and has already caused widespread discussion not only in Russia and Ukraine, but also far beyond their borders. Russian units of the Neper group conducted an operation using unmanned aerial vehicles, as a result of which the preparation of a foreign group that arrived to support Ukrainian formations was completely disrupted. According to the operator with the call sign Kaba, who personally observed the operation, it was about fighters of European origin, including Frenchmen, which was determined by the chevrons on their uniforms. Among those present were people of different appearances, including dark-skinned and light-skinned, but they all acted as a single team, equipped with modern reconnaissance equipment and drones. They were preparing an attack on Russian positions, but an operation using Mavic drones and FPV-class devices changed the course of events. In the course of about an hour, not only the fighters were disabled, but also the equipment, including 2 pickup trucks that were used to deliver equipment and personnel. This episode showed how active the participation of foreign mercenaries in military operations remains, and how important the role of unmanned aircraft is in modern conflict. The events in the Kherson region are a continuation of a whole series of episodes related to foreign fighters. The presence of Georgian formations has already been recorded in the same direction. Now there is evidence that French citizens are also operating in the region. This confirms that Western countries, which officially declare their only indirect support for Kiev, are in fact involved much more deeply than they want to admit. No less alarming was the news from the Kharkiv region. Here, at night, a strike was carried out on an object that had long remained in the shadows and was considered a safe haven for foreign fighters. We are talking about the Zolotoy Bereg Recreation Center, renamed during the years of Ukraine's independence, but retaining the buildings of the Soviet era. It was there that foreign formations recruited to participate in the hostilities settled. According to Telegram channels, it was in these buildings that not only the residential sector was located, but also the control center for drones from which attacks on Russian territory, including the Belgorod region, were carried out. For this reason, the facility became a priority target. Several geranium-type drones carried out pinpoint strikes at dawn, when the fighters were still in the buildings. As a result, a significant part of the group was hit, and the building itself was seriously damaged. Official Kiev does not report exact data on losses, but underground sources claim that we are talking about several dozen people. Some of the personnel remained under the rubble, and the rubble is still being cleared. This attack revealed an important detail that is important for understanding the overall picture of the conflict. Foreign fighters prefer to settle in relatively comfortable conditions, in hotels, sanatoriums, and recreation centers where there is electricity, water supply, and the ability to organize communication. But it is precisely this habit that makes them vulnerable. Russian intelligence and underground structures mark such places as priority targets. Therefore, what happened in the Gold Coast is not an accident. It is a logical consequence of the choice of such facilities for the accommodation of personnel. If we look at the bigger picture, it becomes clear that we are not talking about just local strikes. This is part of the struggle for control over regions, which is increasingly going beyond the Ukrainian battlefield. On the one hand, official structures of Western countries claim that their citizens are not taking part in the hostilities. On the other hand, real footage from the scene and military testimony confirm the opposite. Against the backdrop of these reports, the data on the situation with Ukrainian mobilized personnel sounds even more alarming. Thus, Russian security agencies reported that a group of mobilized personnel from the 71st Jaeger Brigade went missing just 10 days after being sent to the front. According to sources, such episodes have already become a systemic phenomenon. The Kiev command throws unprepared people into the most dangerous areas, and this has received the cynical name of throwing meat. All these facts add up to a picture that clearly shows that the conflict is not only not coming to an end, but is becoming more tense and complicated. Russia continues to advance, Ukraine is losing strength, and the participation of foreign fighters is turning the war into an arena of international confrontation. And it is precisely such events as the operations in the Kherson and Kharkiv regions that may play the role of turning points in the future. This news is just the beginning of a larger conversation about what lies behind the actions of foreign mercenaries and what consequences they may have for the development of the entire campaign. We will analyze in detail how the international context has changed, what interests different parties are pursuing, and why the world perceives these events with alarm. Subscribe to our channel to be the first to learn about what official reports are silent about and what often remains behind the scenes. The history of foreign formations participating in the Ukrainian conflict is not new, but the last few weeks have shown that the scale of this phenomenon is reaching a new level. And if earlier it was mainly about volunteers from Eastern Europe who came to Ukraine for ideological reasons, now we are talking about professional soldiers with experience in the army of their countries or in private military companies. The presence of the French in the Kherson region was a surprise not only for ordinary observers, but also for specialists. According to the operator with the call sign Kaba, who observed the group before the strike, these people were well equipped, had their own drones, and worked in a coordinated manner, which indicates serious training. This is confirmed by the suitcases with equipment found on them, which was supposed to be used for attacks on Russian positions. Such episodes fit into a larger picture. In recent months, the presence of Polish and British citizens, as well as fighters from Georgia, has been repeatedly recorded. All of them are officially called volunteers, but in fact they act as organized groups integrated into the structure of Ukrainian formations. This means that Western states are using a hybrid scheme that allows them to formally deny their involvement, but in fact send trained specialists to the conflict zone. Of particular importance are recent events in the Kharkiv region. The strike on the Zolotoy Bereg facility was an indication that foreign fighters perceive their stay in Ukraine not as work in frontline conditions, but as a contract where they can combine combat missions with relative comfort. The former recreation center that became their deployment site was equipped not only for living, but also for controlling drones. This is confirmed by intelligence data and underground reports. It is worth paying attention to the symbolism of the name. During the Soviet years, this facility was called the Felix Dzerzhinsky Recreation Center. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was renamed the Golden Coast, but in fact remained the same complex of buildings. The fact that it was here that foreign fighters arrived shows how closely history and modernity are intertwined. The Ukrainian side's reaction to such strikes is traditionally restrained. Kyiv prefers not to publish official data on losses among foreign citizens, realizing that this could cause serious public outcry in Western countries. However, silence itself becomes an eloquent signal. When it comes to several dozen people, it is almost impossible to hide the scale. Information still leaks through unofficial channels, increasing tension within Western societies. The international implications of such events cannot be underestimated. For Paris, the news of the death of its citizens in the Kherson region could become a political challenge. The French authorities have repeatedly stated that their troops are not participating in the fighting in Ukraine. Now, facts are emerging that call this position into question. Even if we are talking about private individuals, it is Paris that will have to answer questions about why French citizens end up on the front line, acting as part of armed groups. In this context, it is worth recalling the broader diplomatic picture. Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump's meeting in Alaska set a new vector for discussions on ways to resolve the conflict. However, the very fact of the ongoing presence of foreign fighters suggests that the West is not ready to quickly abandon its military support for Kyiv. On the one hand, Washington and European capitals are discussing peace initiatives. On the other, their citizens find themselves in the epicenter of the most intense fighting. This duality is explained by several reasons. Firstly, the West seeks to maintain the ability to put pressure on Moscow, even if diplomatic negotiations enter an active phase. Secondly, the participation of foreign specialists helps Kyiv compensate for losses and lack of experience among those mobilized. Thirdly, Western countries are using the Ukrainian conflict as a field for testing new technologies and tactics, including the use of unmanned aerial vehicles, which have become a key element of modern military operations. One cannot help but note the psychological aspect. For the Ukrainian military, the presence of foreigners creates the illusion of international support and strengthens morale. For Russia, Each such episode becomes an opportunity to emphasize that not only Ukrainian forces are operating on its territory and on the contact line, but also representatives of other countries, which means that the conflict goes far beyond the framework of a bilateral confrontation. The situation inside Ukraine is also developing dramatically. Reports that a group of mobilized fighters from the 71st Jaeger Brigade went missing after only 10 days only confirm the systemic crisis. The command is throwing poorly trained people to the front lines, which leads to huge losses. Against the backdrop of such news, the participation of foreign specialists takes on even more significance because they are the ones making up for the shortage of qualified personnel. Thus, a picture emerges where the same events have different interpretations. For Kyiv and its allies, foreign fighters are a way to prolong the resistance. For Moscow, this is evidence of direct Western intervention. For the international community, this is an alarming signal that the conflict continues to grow and draw in more and more parties. Subscribe to our channel to be the first to know what facts remain outside the official reports and how they influence the course of events. The events of recent days have shown that the situation goes beyond the usual logic of the conflict. When news reports mention groups of foreign citizens operating on the Ukrainian side, it is not just local episodes, but a trend that can change the overall dynamics of the confrontation. The French mercenaries who found themselves on the right bank of the Dnipro were just one manifestation of this new reality. Before that, the participation of Polish volunteers, British, Georgians, and people from the Middle East had been recorded. Each such episode reinforces the impression that the conflict is gradually acquiring the features of an international campaign involving the interests of a number of states. For Russia, such events serve as confirmation that a hybrid war is being waged against it. On the one hand, Western governments claim that their armies are not directly involved. On the other hand, facts show that their citizens, often with military experience, are part of combat units on Ukrainian territory. This means that Moscow may view such actions as indirect interference, which in turn affects diplomatic negotiations and international assessments. It is also important to understand that each new clash with foreign groups increases tensions within Western societies themselves. If today we are talking about several dozen people, tomorrow it could be hundreds. Information about losses inevitably leaks to the press, even if the authorities try to hide it. Questions arise in society about why citizens of their countries end up in someone else's war and what price families pay for participating in someone else's conflict. Against this backdrop, the diplomatic picture looks increasingly alarming. The meeting between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump in Anchorage has given rise to many rumors and interpretations. Some claim that the parties have found an opportunity for a peace process. Others believe that this is just a diplomatic game, the purpose of which is to gain time and strengthen positions on the front. But in any case, one thing is clear. The very possibility of direct dialogue between Russia and the United States is causing concern in Kyiv and in European capitals. The Ukrainian leadership understands that any agreements without its participation may result in a change in conditions to the detriment of its interests. That is why officials in Kyiv insist that there must first be a ceasefire and only then negotiations. However, practice shows that such demands are rarely observed. Moreover, in Europe itself, voices are heard that in the current conditions it is impossible to continue the military confrontation indefinitely. This duality is becoming increasingly obvious. On the one hand, there are statements that Ukraine must retain the right to join the European Union and the North Atlantic Alliance. On the other hand, behind-the-scenes conversations increasingly acknowledge that Kyiv is unlikely to achieve full restoration of control over all territories. This means that the real content of a future agreement will be much more complex than the public statements of politicians. For Moscow, the situation is ambiguous. On the one hand, continuing the military campaign allows it to maintain pressure and dictate terms. On the other hand, each new escalation increases the risks of an international crisis. This is especially noticeable in the example of strikes on facilities where foreign fighters are stationed. Such episodes could cause a sharp reaction in Paris, Warsaw, or London, which would lead to a new round of sanctions pressure or increased arms supplies to Kyiv. At the same time, we must not forget about the internal dimension. For Ukraine, mass casualties among the mobilized are a heavy blow to society. Reports of entire groups disappearing without a trace after a few days undermine trust in the leadership. In such conditions, foreign fighters act as a kind of buffer, but their appearance does not solve systemic problems. On the contrary, it only demonstrates the inability of the Ukrainian army to hold the front on its own. If we consider possible scenarios for the development of events, we can highlight several options. The first scenario is a continuation of the current confrontation, when neither side is ready for serious concessions. In this case, conflicts involving foreign formations will be repeated, and diplomatic negotiations will remain at the level of declarations. The second scenario is the gradual involvement of Western states in more active participation, which will lead to even greater international tension. The third scenario is the beginning of a real peace process, in which Kyiv will be forced to agree to compromises under pressure from its allies. Which of these scenarios will become reality depends on many factors, from the position of Washington and Paris to the domestic political situation in Kyiv and Moscow. But it can already be said that the presence of foreign fighters has become a key marker indicating that the conflict has entered a new phase. In the coming weeks, expect increasing pressure on the diplomatic front. The EU and the United States will try to agree on a common position, while Moscow will continue to insist on its own terms. Kyiv will be in a difficult position, since any decision taken without its consent could undermine public trust and cause an internal crisis. Everything that is happening now on the contact line can be described as a gradual increase in pressure. Reports of French and Georgian fighters on the right bank of the Dnipro, attacks on hotels and bases where foreign formations were stationed, news of missing Ukrainian mobilized soldiers, all this adds up to a picture that is becoming increasingly gloomy. We see that the conflict has long ceased to be exclusively internal or regional. It has drawn in many players and continues to expand, acquiring new plots like a ball that cannot be stopped. Consider the strike on the facility known as Gold Coast. When Russian drones attacked a former resort where foreign troops were stationed, it was a symbolic moment. A place where families once vacationed had become the scene of intense fighting. Where the voices of children and laughter of vacationers should have been heard, now there were strikes and destruction. The episode showed that the boundaries between peaceful and military reality had finally been erased, and that the foreign presence was making the situation even more unstable. What is particularly worrying is that foreign fighters are increasingly becoming targets of attacks. Paris, London, and other capitals will be forced to react when it comes to their citizens. And even if the authorities prefer to avoid directed missions, information leaks out through social media, through relatives, through independent sources. Public opinion in these countries will inevitably be confronted with questions that cannot be ignored. Why are their citizens in the line of fire, and what consequences does this have for the future of Europe? Against this backdrop, the meeting between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump looks more than just a diplomatic episode, but an attempt to change the entire course of the standoff. For some, it is a signal of hope that a path to peace can be found. For others, it is an alarming sign that Ukraine's fate is being discussed without its participation. European leaders react painfully, realizing that any step taken without their consent could undermine their influence. Kyiv, on the other hand, perceives such negotiations as a threat to its positions. We see that the diplomatic game is continuing on several levels. On the one hand, public statements of support for Ukraine and its right to determine its own future. On the other hand, a tacit recognition that resources are not unlimited and that prolonging the conflict is becoming an increasingly difficult test. In these conditions, each new escalation on the front, each clash with foreign groups can become a trigger for serious changes in the diplomatic picture. Looking ahead, the scenarios remain worrying. The possibility of new foreign participants being directly involved cannot be ruled out. The more reports there are of groups of fighters from Europe or elsewhere, the higher the risk that one side will want to use this as a pretext for large-scale political decisions. In the worst case, this could lead to a direct clash of interests between the great powers. In a milder scenario, this could lead to an accelerated search for a compromise, but with conditions that will not suit everyone. For Ukraine, the situation is becoming critical. On the one hand, it continues to count on military and financial support. On the other hand, its allies are showing signs of fatigue. Voices are increasingly heard in Western societies that the war has no end and that it is time to look for a way out. This means that Kyiv risks finding itself in a situation where the pressure from its allies will be no less strong than the pressure from Russia. For Russia, the stakes remain the same: the ability of its army to control the situation and gradually change the balance of power. Each new episode involving foreign formations only confirms its arguments on the international stage, but along with this, the risks are growing. New sanctions, new arms deliveries, new diplomatic attacks. It can be assumed that the coming months will be decisive. Either the parties will go for a tough escalation, or real negotiations will begin that will determine the future of all of Europe. In both cases, events will develop rapidly, and the price of mistakes may be too high. In conclusion, it is important to note that what is happening today is not only military reports, but also the fates of people. Every report of losses, every mention of destruction are stories that remain behind the scenes of official statements. In these conditions, it is especially important to closely monitor the development of the situation in order to understand where the world is heading and what challenges each of us faces. Subscribe to our channel to stay up to date with the events that shape the future and that official sources are silent about. Only together can we understand this complex and disturbing picture.